Alright, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today I've got some homework to do. Let's kind of just a little bit go over what we did last time really quick. And we were doing this ayah. أو تقول لو أن أنزل علينا الكتاب لكنا أهدى منهم. We went in details with that one. We went in details with how they were really laying out what they considered as an argument and a justification to uh, why they thought that it was a good justification to not believe in basically the Quran and not believe in the revelation. So that was refuting both of these, or at least anticipated arguments that they thought that they were going to lay out, which is, well, the first one was basically they said that, well, we don't have a trace to study the previous scriptures, so we're not really sure whether it's compatible with the previous scriptures. So the ayah was letting them know that, well, you've got some of those traces of those scriptures, but to say that, well, we're not necessarily fluent in studying these scriptures, that's not necessarily a standing reason or a standing defense, because you do have the resources to at least know in general that there was a revelation that was sent. So you don't necessarily have to know every single detail within that scripture, but you would know that historically and that previously there were revelations that were sent for people to let them know that there is a purpose to their existence. So that's the first thing. Do they necessarily have to know all the details within those scriptures? The answer is no. It's enough to know that the Lord Almighty had sent scriptures, notifications of reasons to basically the purpose of their existence, and that there is basically, as a general note, that there is a God Almighty, that there is a judgment day, that you are held accountable, that there is Jannah, Nar. So that's the general information, and you don't necessarily have to know all the details. That general information is the key to help you basically identify that there is the foundation of a revelation that was already there, and that the Quran was confirming that revelation with at least the key information of it. The second part is that لو أو تقول لو أن أنزل علينا الكتاب لكنا أهدى منهم. And we basically stopped at the word أهدى منهم because they had said, well, if only we had the revelation, we would have been more righteous. So they do recognize, and that was the inference, they do recognize that there is the foundation of morality, the foundation of ethics, and certainly especially when you talk about atheists, for example, they will say that there is no subjective morality, but of course, they would still consider that there is a certain morality that they have to abide by, and they want to claim that they just know it just for, I guess, knowing certain physics, and it just makes our life better. But then, of course, they do recognize, and they will have to recognize, that all moralities, regardless of whether they believed in religion or not, all of them were actually plagiarized from religion. But one thing that this ayah is also inferring is that there is an instinct deep on the inside of us that we do recognize a certain level of morality, a certain level of ethics. In other words, think of it as a programming that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it within side of us, which basically helps us recognize truth, or recognize at least the foundations, whether we're speaking about morality or whether we're speaking about recognizing truth to a certain extent. In other words, we recognize that not everything is created, or at least we recognize that not everything is created in absurdity, and we recognize recognize that there is a foundation of truth. That's the key thing about that ayah, is that when they said لَكُنَّا أَهْدَى مِنْهُمْ, what this was responding to is that they considered there is no definition of truth, there is no definition of morality, there is no definition for that revelation, there is no foundation for that revelation. So the ayah was letting them know, well, you yourself, you recognize a certain level of morality, a certain level of justice, a certain level of right and wrong. So therefore, you do recognize that there is a foundation to when we say something is right or something is wrong, that would, by definition, mean that there's going to be accountability. That there's going to be accountability, and that if there's the definition that you recognize that this world is based on a certain border, there's a beginning, there's an end, there's a certain border, there's a certain foundation, then you would recognize then by that definition that this life is based on a premise, that this life is based on a premise, that this life was founded on a purpose, that this life is not created in absurdity, or at least was not founded on absurdity. So that's the first part. The second part is basically that they're also admitting that the Muslims, or at least these people that are adopting faith, that they are basically adopting a certain level of discipline. They're adopting a certain level of righteousness. And that's the key inference right there, that they're not considering that certainly that there's no foundation of truth. That's the key things, that they consider that there's a foundation of truth, and then how they adopt that truth is basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting them basically look within, study and review that instinct, and review the logic that they had considered that there is a foundation for righteousness, foundation for truth. So based on that logic, you cannot whatsoever ostracize, or at least remove, that there is also a revelation that continues that definition that you already recognize. You already recognize that there's a foundation for truth. Well, this is to continue that foundation. So we went in details with that one. And فَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بَيِّنَةٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةٌ. One thing I didn't say last time, I want you to look at this one. So they were seeking, or at least they weren't seeking per se, but that they were basically rejecting faith. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting them know key things to finding faith. And I didn't mention this last time. Let's look into this ayah, because this is actually key. When you look into this ayah, it's giving us a number of different keys. Let's see. فَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بَيِّنَةٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةٌ. Those are three different things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know that what would cure al-ghafla, and what would cure basically that misconception, is basically these three items. Okay, remember this. You have, why would people lose their way to guidance? Number one is that you have what is called a shahawat, and number two is shubuhat. What's the difference? Shahawat are basically the different desires to perhaps gain social acceptance, different desires to probably get a job, different desires to probably, I don't know, money, dunya, etc. All of these different things. Those are desires. Those are shahawat. Shubuhat are far more dangerous. because it's shubuhat, they're actually the misconceptions. Misconceptions in regard to perhaps maybe one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A person is confused about the existence of God, etc. All of these different things. Here's a misconception about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Misconceptions about the Prophet ﷺ. Is he the prophet, or is he a false prophet, etc.? That's a misconception. Number three, the angels, and questions about theodicy, questions about life, questions about Quran. Is this really the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Is it not, etc.? All of these, they're basically considered as shubuhat, or perhaps even in legislation. So why are men allowed to have more than one wife, but women are not allowed to have more than one husband? These are shubha. Okay, so those are misconceptions. People questioning the number one, questioning the foundation for that revelation. Number two, questioning details within the revelation. Questioning details within legislation or details within Tawheed, all of that. That's basically misconceptions. Okay, now, and this is very important to classify, because oftentimes I would get people bringing me their daughters, or people bringing me their children, or even adults, and coming in. And sometimes, you would have a teenager, for example. She comes in and she basically would come in with some of the misconceptions. But then you discover that the foundation for the misconception is not a misconception per se, as much as it is a desire to fit in, or a desire to gain some social acceptance. Okay. Now, if I am a mentor and trying to, let's say, give guidance to this girl, let's say 16-year-old girl, I'm trying to give her guidance. First, I have to recognize the symptoms for misconceptions are completely different than the symptoms for the problem with desires or shahawat. And not until I'm able to classify where the problem is, are you really going to put in the right treatment. Because if this person is struggling with desires and you're there trying to answer misconceptions, then you're really confused. You're basically trying to give lecturing in refuting misconceptions that don't even exist. The girl's probably dealing with social acceptance issue and she's not finding it. So she didn't want to feel that contradiction between her faith or her identity and what she wants to believe in. So she goes into these confusions, and then she basically adopts certain ideas that don't necessarily let's say, sit in her mind, but it's just that, it's just that way of trying to make herself comfortable in a certain way, in order to not feel that contradiction between what she's displaying on the outside and what she's believing on the inside. But then on the inside, it's more of a battle of identity, a battle of wanting to gain social acceptance, and also, yes, believes, but not really sure about faith. There's some skepticism, not really sure, etc. Then in order to solve this matter, we first have to know that classification of where the problem is, where that problem resides, whether it's in the heart, or whether it's in the psychology, or whether it's in the mind, or whether it's in probably just a phase. Then in that situation, we have to treat it first by recognizing where that problem is. Now, why did I even mention that one in the midst of explaining this ayah? Well, when you look at the misconceptions that they had come with, which is in the context of this ayah, the context of this ayah was letting us know that they were living well, they were admitting and confessing that they were living in ghafla. What is the word ghafla? So the word ghafla actually means a person that is unaware, a person that is at a moment, they do recognize something, but they're pacified with something else. And this lifestyle that they're living perhaps is making their attention and their focus basically be on one certain thing, that they're completely at that moment pacified away from remembering, from recognizing, from basically letting that point, whether it's يوم القيامة, or whether it's death, or whether it's life, or in the different things about revelation and what the revelation is basically teaching, they're completely pacified with it because they're busy with something else. So that's al-ghafla. Okay, that's al-ghafla. So how do we fix this ghafla is the question. The other part is that they were also living in some form of skepticism, just wondering how could this revelation at all be of any worth, because we could all already find some level of ethics, some level of guidance. We already have a foundation. So they do recognize some level of truth, but they're confused and they're living in this misconception whether this relates to what they are finding on the inside. That's the first confusion. The second confusion is whether they're capable of living this level of righteousness, and they're basically right there. And it's like, is this harsh? Is this too much? Is this, hey, we could have actually been more disciplined? How do we reconcile the two? Basically, the feeling on the inside, the misconceptions in the mind, and basically that acceptance, and basically the attention. How do we put these pieces together? And that's usually, I would say, that's usually the problem, especially in younger age groups. In younger age groups, you would find these misconceptions, trying to eschew and trying to go away from wanting to really rethink things out. And that's why that ayah was saying, يصدفون. They wanted to isolate themselves completely away from rethinking their lifestyle, from rethinking the foundation of their life, from rethinking about everything that relates to existence. They were just yasdifun. And those are key things. You just like when we have psychology, okay, there's also that basis for an Islamic type of psychology. And this is part of it, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us, that is part of human psychology, that you would see certain people, they're living in this ghafla where they're pacified with other things, and then they don't want to recognize. They just feel so comfortable with what they're living and focused on that they're completely isolating themselves from wanting to even know truth, because they don't want to feel this level of a contradiction between what they're living in and also what they would recognize deep on the inside as basically letting them know that you do recognize on the inside that there's a level of truth, but you had chosen to just pacify yourself away from it. You had chosen to just redirect your visions elsewhere because you didn't want to miss out on some of the dunya things. So the psychology that they would be living in is number one, living at a certain level of ghafla. Let's look into that. They would be living at a certain level of ghafla, basically getting themselves busy with something else. Number two, that they would pacify themselves and basically not live a certain level of discipline. In other words, there's a certain level of discipline that is necessary in order to treat and heal this ghafla, but they are basically eschewing it by saying, well, we could have been better, but yeah, well, we don't really have much time to somehow grow into that discipline, or perhaps putting that discipline into experiment to see if it's right for us or not. So what they would say is that, we don't have time for that. We've got a lot of different things that we are busy with. But then what happens is that this lifestyle will continue, and then eventually they will isolate themselves completely because their lifestyle is really based on the lifestyle of just wanting to gain more of this dunya. Okay, so what is the Quranic treatment for all of this, whether we're speaking about the start of it, or whether we're speaking about the culture of it, or whether we're speaking about the way that it will end up in? What is the treatment? So the treatment is basically, number one, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بَيِّنَةٌ. You've got the bayina. What is al-bayina? Al-bayina is basically a clarification. Okay, that's the first thing. Number one, the root is bana. The root bana actually means when something, perhaps you cannot see it, but then now it becomes visible to you. Okay, that's the first bayina. But here's one thing. Is it necessarily a type of visible to mean that we're talking about something that I could see? Or is this talking about a bayina where we're talking about mental visibility? What type of level of bayina are we really talking about? So that's when you would see the word bayina, and it would be good to go back to Surah al-Bayyinah and just connect some of those dots. So let's go really fast to Surah al-Bayyinah. We've got page 158. This is the page that we have right now. We're going to go jump to Surah al-Bayyinah right there and see. Okay, where is it? No, a little bit farther. Don't worry, we're going to get there. Let's see, what surah is this? This is Surah al-Fajr, and al-Bayyinah is this way. No, is it? No, العلق البينة. Here we go. لم يكن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين منفكين حتى تأتيهم البينة. Here we go. So, البينة. What is البينة? رسول من الله يتلو صحفا مطهرة. That's البينة. Bayina is basically a prophet from Allah Almighty, that is sent from Allah Almighty, who would recite to them suhufan, basically different revelations, or at least different suhuf. A suhuf can be a manuscript, or a suhuf can be a written document, basically call it the written book. And the word is mutahhara. What is al-mutahhara? Mutahhara means pure. So why did you call it pure? Why pure? What is the definition of pure? فيها كتب قيمة. What is the definition of pure? So when you look at the definition of pure, you're going to need to go to Surah al-Muddathir. Let's go to Surah al-Muddathir because that relates to purity. And let's just see Surah al-Muddathir when it was actually talking about purification. يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر. So the Prophet ﷺ being bundled up basically in his blanket, and then it tells us قم فأنذر. You need to get up and you need to basically be on a mission and start warning the people. So just like going to Surah al-Bayyinah when it was talking about رسول من الله يتلو صحفا مطهرة. This is basically continuing that surah, continuing the whole idea that you've got قم فأنذر. Here's that رسول من الله يتلو صحفا مطهرة. مطهرة how? مطهرة ربك فكبر. Inner purification, glorifying your Lord. In other words, what does an inner purification look like? You're glorifying your Lord. That means you're removing every certain and every single thing that may be taking your attention and putting you in a state of ghafla. So, in order to purify yourself and to live the bayina, you need to first start with the foundation of recognizing Allahu Akbar. Then what? ثِيَابَكَ فَطَهَّرْ. There's a certain level of purification of your own garments. Your own garments, they need to contain not only removing whatever of a contamination, a physical contamination, but the way you dress, the way you behave, and that is basically going to determine a lot of what your identity is and who you are and what your focus is really centered on. So the ayah says, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ. When it said, رَسُولٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ يَتْلُو صُحُفًا مُطَهَّرَةً, letting you know you've got a foundation. ثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ. You need to purify your garment. You need to not only purify yourself internally, but you also need to purify yourself externally. How do you purify yourself externally? It's not just talking about purifying your garment alone, but this is talking about waruz fahjur. In other words, behavior. Your behavior, in order to correct it, you basically need to remove every single contamination, but you're not going to be capable of knowing which behavior is acceptable, which behavior is not acceptable, if you don't actually have Rasulun min Allahi yatlu suhufan mutahhara. If you don't have a prophet to basically clarify and break down for you the definitions of morality, the definitions of ethics, and that's why it wanted you to know that we're also including ethics. So it said, وَلَا تَمْنُن تَسْتَكْثِرْ. Do not brag and do not praise others just to gain some kind of a financial gain or a financial interest. وَلِرَبِّكَ فَاصْبِرْ. In the most important morality that you would live in, and the most important level of discipline that you would embrace is basically a sabr, is basically patience. Recognize that there's going to be a certain amount and there's going to be a certain level of pain, and that you basically would have to strive beyond this pain and have to strive even through the pain in order to learn how to go beyond it and not be focused on the pain, but be focused on the gain. Now, going back to that ayah and connecting these dots, you go back to this ayah and you basically see the same thing. Let's see the same thing in what this ayah was basically letting us know. And here we go again. And this ayah is basically taking us فَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بَيِّنَةٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ, that you actually received al-bayyinah, meaning one, al-bayyinah, where it's giving you a mental clarification. It's helping you see with all that logic, with the revelation itself, connecting these dots, that it traces back all the way to even before your existence, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically giving you the information about your existence before you even existed, and that there is a reason for your existence. In other words, there is the essence that basically preceded your existence, and the reason for your existence, and the purpose for your existence. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting you know that there is the bayina, the revelation itself contains the bayina to help you see the logic, to help you understand why this world was created, to help you recognize the direction you're heading towards. And plus, well, that's not enough to know mentally, but that's also enough to know that you've got that clarification that contains al-huda. Now, I want you to look at the word wa. Is wa necessarily just an addition, or can wa also mean some sort of containment as well? So if I were to say, I got you fruits, and I also had apples and bananas and all of that, does that mean apples and bananas are not fruits? No, they're fruits. They're part of it, in fact. Okay, that's the same thing in Lugha Arabiya. we can say in English, your teacher would basically underline it and say, well, anyways, you said fruits, why are you including apples and bananas? But in Lugha Arabiya, you can actually do that, and that would not be considered as incoherent. Okay? That would not be considered as an incoherent because the letter wa could also mean a combination of something. Think of it as a semicolon to tell me, I got you fruits, and then semicolon, and then it would list what fruits that you got, probably apples, bananas, pineapples, whatever it is. That's basically the fruit that I got, and I put a semicolon. So in Arabic, they did have punctuation, but in Arabic, the letter wa can be an inclusive pronoun, can be an inclusive preposition to be more accurate. Okay, so when you look at bayina wahuda, this isn't talking about an additional thing, but this is basically clarifying that this bayina contains not only the logic, but it also contains the guidance itself to help you recognize where you're going, to help you embrace a certain level of discipline. Why is that important, though? You know, when we speak about whether psychological illnesses or whether we're speaking about certain mental illnesses or whether we're speaking about, let's call it religious illnesses as well, if you don't embrace the discipline, a certain level of behavior, your behavior has the capacity to change a lot of what's actually in your mind and a lot of what's in your heart, whether towards the good or whether towards the evil. In other words, what you listen to, what you eat, what you drink, what you speak in, and what friends you basically surround yourself with, all of that has a direct relationship with what your identity, at least internal identity, is. Your external identity is not separate from your internal identity. Therefore, part of the treatment to some of the contaminations or to some of the disorders basically happening on the inside or on the outside, whether behavioral disorder or whether religious disorder, psychological disorder, mental disorder, some of that is fixable. Some of it is fixable by fixing the behavior and by fixing the environment and by fixing what this person is basically consuming as well. That's basically letting us know that al-huda and faith is not necessarily just an internal choice, but that it's actually also including what choices you make in terms of behavior, in terms of consumption, in terms of choices on the inside, what you listen to, what you eat, what you drink, what you're looking at. All of that is going to have an impact in contaminating, correcting, healing, treating basically the inside. Treating what? Treating the ghafla, treating the confusion about identity, and treating basically that isolation away from faith that that person might have chosen to put themselves into. So therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting us know the key to a number of different religious, or let's call it psyche treatment as well. It first starts, if you want to treat somebody, they first have to take the time to learn. And that's going to remove the ghafla. We need to redirect their focus. We need to redirect their place of vision, whether what they're looking at or what their mind is continuously thinking about. So we need to reconsider We need to help them reconsider what their mind is busy with by giving them bayina. How do we give al-bayina? Certain sessions of learning the deen, certain sessions of perhaps maybe associating with salihin. Maybe we need to redirect them. Sometimes we need to redirect them by changing the environment. Maybe we need to redirect them by perhaps letting them take new classes or telling them and advising them, I need you to join this class. But I already know this information. I took it in school. Yes, the information you know is not always necessarily relating to, yes, I have this information known, but sometimes you need a revival for that information. You need to restudy it and you need to bring it back to your attention because you are trying to fix al-ghafla. Is it possible that a person that probably studied Islam, or a person that probably studied Quran, or a person that probably memorized even the Quran can live in a state of ghafla? Yes, it can happen that the person does have the information there, but because they had been pacified away from Huda, it can become something that is forgotten because of ghafla. Because the behavior basically can affect the person and let them live in ghafla as a result of basically living away from huda, living away from guidance. So how do we treat that? We need to bring about that bayina, whether probably let them maybe listen to maybe certain lectures, join certain series, or perhaps maybe join different groups that speak about different topics that relate to their akhirah, that relate to basically their deen, etc. That's al-bayina. Or perhaps sometimes we need to see where is the problem. Is the problem perhaps maybe the university that they're joining? The university is probably an atheistic university. Maybe they need to change that university. Or maybe that's a missionary university. Maybe they're getting a misconception elsewhere. Maybe they need to change the country. Just like the guy that changed the city that he was living in. Remember the guy that killed 99 people? He killed 99 people. What was the treatment? He said, you got to change the country. You got to change the environment entirely. That's what's going to help you get into that treatment because you definitely have the inner desire to seek tawbah. Well, the biggest proof is that you, after killing 99 people, you decided you wanted to repent. But then when you didn't get the answer, you topped them with 100, but then you still had this uh, perseverance that you still want to do tawbah. But what is making you go back to this wrong behavior and becoming a serial killer? What's making you go back is basically the discipline. The discipline is what's making you go back. It's the environment. The environment is causing a certain behavior, and then that behavior basically triggers this wrong type of action, and then you become confused and you're not capable of holding yourself. And this is really important that sometimes we need to understand what the problem is in order to bring about the treatment. This isn't just about medicine, but that's the same thing when we're talking about religious confusion as well. The religious confusion is not any different because you have to first recognize where the problem is, and you have to then bring about the solution based on that person. And that's one thing, by the way, that Sufis do beautifully in creating new environments. I'm not talking about all Sufis, but creating new environments in order to bring about al-hidayah, They would repeat, for example, salah al nabi. They would repeat, for example, dhikr. They would let them learn how to bring about this communal support, to let them repeat it and to let them basically relate to it. They would go together, perhaps maybe visiting ill people, maybe in hospitals, or perhaps go to senior homes, or perhaps go on in groups as missionaries, basically in prisons, or perhaps maybe different places. They would do that as community service. They would do that as a reminder, not for others, but a reminder for themselves. And this is key. Sometimes, even teaching Islam, take the time to teach. Yes, take the time to teach. And I don't necessarily mean teaching as, yes, I've got information, I'm trying to give you that information, but not every single teaching is necessarily to bring about information. Sometimes to do that, that's basically to bring about al-bayyinah, to bring it to our attention. الذكرى فذكر إن نفعت الذكرى فذكر الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين. الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين, but I already know that information. Yes, I know you know that information, but it's an issue of dhikra. That's why we do that dhikr. Dhikr is more than just mentioning something. Dhikr is also to repeat something, to bring it to our memory, to bring it to our focus. And this is why when we're looking at that treatment may include and should include discipline treatment, letting them learn how to connect with their heart by taking away the distractions that are one, distracting them, whether it's an environment or whether it's what they're listening to, or whether it's what they're seeing or what they're eating. That's why if you were to look at the five pillars in Islam, you look at number one is shahada. Okay, that's the first part. It's basically recognizing in the brain, but shahada is more than just recognizing the brain, because a shahada is involving a certain level of acknowledgement that went beyond me witnessing something to me processing it in my brain internally and regarding it as if I could see it in all its details and I could recognize it as if I am witnessing it with my own bare eyes. That's what a shahada is. Then we go into discipline too. 5 times a day of prayer. Why 5 times a day? That isn't that just too much of praying 5 times a day? Well, that's because to also let us learn that there's that level of discipline, that repetitive behavior is crucial. But why are we saying the same thing in Dhuhr, the same thing in Asr, the same thing in all the prayers, Al-Fatiha, Subhana Rabbi al-Azim, Subhana Rabbi al-A'la, Allahu Akbar? Why repeat everything? That's also letting us know that your brain works in what repetitive behavior you put in it. Repetitive behavior is how we basically function. Whether we're talking about training in salah or repeating our salah and repeating our behavior, or whether we're speaking about repetitive behavior and making pancakes or shooting baskets or whatever it is, repetitive behavior is what really changes your identity. It changes your skills. It changes who you are. It changes what you're able to basically master, whether externally or internally. But then the external behavior, why can't we just sit kind of like the yoga and just close our eyes and just think really hard and just know and keep saying perhaps, or at least remember that Allah created me. I'm very happy about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created me and so forth. Why do the motions with it? Why do ruku'? Why do sujood? Why even make all these movements? That's also for us to learn that these movements, whether ruku' or sujood, definitely it's tawqifi. There's no question about that. It's basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically taught us and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically revealed that this is what the prayer should look like. This is what you should do. Any attempt to change it or any attempt to probably think, well, if we were to add this or that, well, that would be considered a bid'ah. But one thing that we learn from all of this is that the repetition, whether repetitive behavior throughout the day or repetitive words throughout the day, what you would be hearing, or repetitive behavior throughout the week, Salat al-Jumu'ah, for example, repetitive behavior of abstaining from certain foods, Siyam al-Ithnain, Siyam fasting on Mondays, fasting on Thursdays, doing certain behaviors throughout the week or throughout basically the day or throughout the year or throughout the month, whether in what you consume, how much you consume, or what behaviors you engage in, or what environment you put yourself in, all of that has a direct influence on your identity and what you are. And this is part of that treatment. Remember, when we always say this, when Prophet Ayub, he basically complained, Inni masani ad-dur wa anta arhamur rahimin. Basically complained that the illness had taken, a strong grip on him. Wa anta arhamur rahimin. And you're the one that is most merciful. What did he tell him? Did he tell him, you know what, kun fayakun, I'm just going to take away the illness and you're going to be just fine just within a second, or even kun, even before, between the kaf and the noon, as they say, even though there's no evidence on that between kaf and the noon. But regardless, okay, just that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, no, you need to put in a set of different treatments. أركض برجلك. هذا مغتسل بارد وشراب. I need you to put in a certain amount of workout. أركض برجلك. I want you to get up, start walking. هذا مغتسل بارد. Here's that treatment that you need to basically put on your body, whether it's a skin treatment or whether there's a sharab, whether it's an antibiotic or who knows what that sharab was. It was just something that he had to take, a certain oral medication, a certain medication that he was supposed to put on his body, and then he was supposed to also walk. أركض برجلك. You need to walk. You need to basically put in a number of steps, basically, or basically running, walking, whatever it is that he was supposed to be doing. At the end of the day, is that there is also that key thing, is that in order to get to hidayah, don't expect hidayah to somehow come to you in a dream. Don't expect hidayah to come to you in a dream, or hidayah to come to you somehow where you get, what they would call as it was like a moment of epiphany. It doesn't have to be a moment of an epiphany that all of a sudden, like you're getting a light bulb right there. But you have to recognize that you need to walk to that hidayah. You need to put in that hidayah. You need to put in that discipline. The bayinah is there, the clarification of what you need to do. Oh, and answering the questions about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically there. You need to put in an amount of a time that you would invest in educating yourself about Islam, and you basically need to put in investment in putting that hidayah into practice, whether we're speaking about the basic foundation of shahada, salah, zakah, or siyam, zakah, and also al-hajj if you're capable of doing so. But then this is in order to let us know, even when you talk about zakah, what are you doing? You're giving up on your money. But I made that money. I put in the effort to gain that income. Why am I right now giving up on that income? It's basically to let you know that there is no way that you can gain your love for al-akhirah and at the same time love dunya. they don't dissolve. You have to give up on some of your dunya in order to get the akhirah. It doesn't blend. You can't have both at the same time. You can't love al-khair and the shar at the same time. You can't. But you need to, if you want to create more space of love for akhirah, you need to remove your focus on dunya. That's how you get that guidance. And that's the same thing when you look at, for example, what tops it is basically Hajj. Topping it as Hajj and basically leaving even the garments of dunya and putting on a new garment to let you know that ihram, and you're letting everything go, and you're basically with everyone right there, and labbaik Allahumma labbaik labbaik la sharika laka labbaik innal hamda wan ni'mata laka wal mulk la sharika lak. What are you doing? You're repeating the words over and over and over again. And what are you doing? You're also doing that rotation again. You're doing it again. Rotation, whether in a sa'i or whether in a tawaf, a rotation again and again. Again, that repetitive behavior. Repetitive behavior is key to any type of a success, whether religiously or whether in your dunya, every single day, your commitment to go to work, every single day to go to school, every single day to do the same behavior again and again and again is grit. That grit is basically what is considered as the key to success. And that's the same thing, success in dunya and success in akhirah. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting us know that there's a certain bayina that was sent. It was Rasulun min Allah yatlu suhufan mutahhara, and the tahara is key. You know, one thing we know is that people with mental disorders, not all, but tend to basically have a problem with hygiene. A problem with hygiene. And Islam lets us know that part of that treatment is in putting in hygiene, whether in tahara, just like thiyabaka fatahir, or whether in putting in a certain amount of internal tahara. Internal tahara, you remove the hate, you remove the envy, you remove a lot of what is contaminating on the inside. So that's why bayyinatum min rabbikum wa huda wa rahma. The rahma is letting you know that that mercy is key to helping you see basically that recognition of what is necessary in order for you to grow and be included in that rahmah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put within this revelation the keys to help you see that mercy, the keys to help soften you, the keys to make you a person of mercy, to make you a person that basically not only speaks of mercy and not only speaks of guidance and not only speaks of bayina, but embraces al-bayina, clarification, embraces revelation, embraces it into practice in huda, and embraces it deeply, internally, deep on the inside. Now, another thing that we could see is that when you look at bayina and huda, il-bayina is, remember that level in Hadith Jibril alayhi salam. What is in Hadith Jibril? Remember in Hadith Jibril alayhi salam? When Jibril alayhi salam comes to the Prophet sallam in the shape of a man, and he says, Ya Muhammad, أخبرني عن الإسلام. And he said, الإسلام وأن تشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمد رسول الله وتقيم الصلاة وتؤتي, etc. Right? So this is البينة. This is البينة. And then قال أخبرني عن الإيمان. قال أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر والقدر خيره وشره. Okay, here we go. This is الهدى. All right? And أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه. There's no better rahmah than that.
الله أكبر، ما شاء الله حولك، ما شاء الله حولك
There's
دكتورة.
no better rahmah than that.
الله يفتح عليك يا رب.
So when you look at that one, it's basically starting with you with that bayina, and that's the level of Islam. But that level of Islam, you want to live that huda. It's like, okay, an tu'mina billahi wa malaikati. I thought it was an tu'mina billah. Yes, but there's no way to really put in that discipline. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, and then it continues what it wants from you. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, and it gives you certain details that you will not be a part of this person that is living that Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu unless you live that guidance. You won't be part of this Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu unless you put in a certain level of discipline, and that discipline. So أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم الآخر, this is not necessarily something that you are capable. Okay, here it is. I'm going to take a moment and think deep, close my eyes and think deep and just believe in Allah and believe in the malaika and believe in the books and believe. It doesn't work like that. But in order to get to that level, so the Prophet ﷺ is telling you, أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله, he's telling you that what you will get out of living in Huda and that discipline, what you will get is basically that level of believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the malaika. Your heart would not have any doubt in it. But you will not get to that level unless you put in al-hidayah that was clarified in al-bayyinah, in the revelation. So when you look at أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه, in the level of al-ihsan, what did he tell you? Did he tell you, how am I going to, okay, let me see how I could do this, to worship Allah as if I could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No, he's telling you the implication of living il-huda. The more perseverance and the more committed you are in living that huda, that will lead you to basically embracing that rahmah. That will lead you to embracing that level of an ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara, of worshiping Allah as if you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want you to put these three things together, because an tu'mina billahi wa malaikatihi wa kutubihi wa rusulihi, etc., that's the implication that you will get to becoming a mu'min. That's the implication. The implication comes after you putting in a certain level of discipline, and that discipline will basically take away that ghafla, and then it will redirect your focus to a certain level of hidayah, and that level of hidayah will basically lead you to be included in that rahmah. Yet on the other hand, if the person chooses the other way around, they would basically not want al-bayyinah, therefore they're living al-ghafla. They do not want al-hidayah, so they would live based on their own personal ethics, just like Trump. He's basically telling you, hey, I don't recognize and I'm not going to adopt and live basically under whatever, the international law and all of that. No, 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 no. We're not going to go and take that definition. He basically says, well, I'm going to basically consider my own integrity, my own ethics, my own definition. That's all he's just saying, أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى. I'm basically the one that I define the truth, I define interest, I define justice. I'm the one that defines everything. Don't need no international law, don't need anybody's definition, all of that. Nah, put it out. Hey, don't worry, I know how to do it myself. He's basically saying, "Ana rabbukum al-a'la." And this is letting us know that if this continues this way, this will, and Trump will be the one to basically bringing America to the collapse if it continues this way. And subhanallah, Trump. There is no one, even by his name. Trump basically means, the person to exceed the limit. Okay. And subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let us know that anybody or any government or anyone that basically exceeds and tries to battle or tries to let their arrogance and their pride exceed the limit, that's when, boom, that's when they fall. You don't challenge Allah. You don't challenge truth. You don't challenge it. So now we say فمن أظلم ممن كذب بآيات الله وصدف عنها سنجزي الذين يصدفون عنها عن لا إله إلا الله سنجزي الذين يصدفون عن آياتنا سوء العذاب بما كانوا يصدفون. Now, where we promised, now that was because I forgot to mention these points yesterday, so I thought it would be good to actually go back to it. Okay, now we promise to go back to al-Qurtubi right there. Let's say right there. So the Prophet ﷺ, we said in Sahih Muslim, when we went into this ayah, هل ينظرون إلا أن تأتيهم الملائكة أو يأتي ربك أو يأتي بعض آيات ربك يوم يأتي بعض آيات ربك لا ينفع نفسا إيمانها لم تكن آمنت من قبل أو كسبت في إيمانها خيرا. Okay, let's see. So we went in details with this one. And we said this, هل ينظرون إلا أن تأتيهم الملائكة, that this is basically warning them that there's going to be, right now, you've got the opportunity to embrace faith, but there's going to be a time when this is going to be terminated. This is going to be the end of it. Number one, تأتيهم الملائكة, when the malaika would come to them, basically bringing them that this is coming as terminating your life, and that would basically be the end. أو يأتي ربك, your Lord Almighty would come, and we talked about the coming of the Lord Almighty, and we said, well, this isn't the coming of the Lord Almighty, but this is basically letting us know that this is يأتي أمر ربك, and we connected it with a number of different ayat, just like يأتي بعض آيات ربك جاء ربك, etc. So what this would basically mean, this is inferring that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be, one, giving the orders of basically the end of time as يوم القيامة, or which is يأتي بعض آيات ربك جاء ربك والملك صفا صفا, and this would be also then giving us the inference of يأتي ربك to meaning يوم القيامة. And certainly we also talked about this important quote, that this is not involving يأتي ربك for us to somehow imagine that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is transitioning or relocating from one place to another, because we said in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, this form of tajseem, this form of doing some form of giving an image or giving a shape to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically contradict Tawheed, because in that second that you would give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a certain shape or a certain border, that's when you would limit Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how do you limit something? How do you not limit something and at the same time it exists? Remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير. That's enough for us to know. All right, now يأتي بعض آيات ربك. Now some of you, the signs of your Lord Almighty coming, that's that area. And the Prophet ﷺ said ثلاث إذا خرجن لا ينفع نفسا إيمانها لم تكن آمنت من قبل أو كسبت في إيمانها خيرا. Three things, if they were to happen, there would be no solution. In other words, there would be basically no benefit if a person did not believe from before, or even had previously invested good. Three things, if they were to happen, there's no more accepting any investment in doing good, whether in doing in faith or whether in doing good. Number one is when the sun would rise from the west, Dajjal, Antichrist, and Dabbatul Ard. I don't want to go in details with each and every single one. So Dabba is basically the creature that would stand people on their faces. Does that creature exist now, or does this creature somehow evolve from a different creature? Or is it just something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would create then? Allahu A'lam. We don't really have any information. You will have some attempts to explain and some attempts, but really there's no evidence for any. There's no evidence for any. We just know that there is dabbatul ard, and the word dabbatul ard is letting us know that this isn't an alien. It isn't an alien. It's not something that comes from outer space. It basically is something that is in Earth. Is it living today? We just can't see it. Is it living today? Did we just is it going to evolve? Is it going to somehow happen all of a sudden? Allahu alam. Just know. Dabbatul ard. There's a certain creature that's basically going to be there. It's going to be stamping people on their foreheads. How does it stamp? Is it painful? Is it not painful? What does it stamp? Is it putting a dye, or is it somehow burning the skin to make it seem apparent, basically kafir and mu'min, etc.? Allahu a'lam. What kind of a stamp? Allahu a'lam. It just stamps their foreheads, mu'min and kafir, and therefore that would basically be the end of any transition with anybody. Is anybody going to be interested in continuing in any way? Well, now they recognize that that is right now exactly what was foretold before. Now they're seeing mu'min and kafir as the start of Yawm al-Qiyamah. Yawm al-Qiyamah, it's all about separating between mu'min and kafir. It had already started with that dabba, with that sun rising from the other side, and with that dajjal. It already started that there is the mu'min and there's that kafir, and exactly what's going to happen on Judgment Day. All right, and we also talked about this hadith and inna bil maghribi baban maftuhan lit-tawbah, that there's a door that basically is open for tawbah, for repentance, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only close it when the sun would rise from the other side. Okay, now we left off right there. قلت, that is al-Qurtubi, وكذب بهذا كله الخوارج والمعتزلة كما تقدم. I want you to look at this one. So you had some of Muslim groups, al-Khawarij and al-Mu'tazila. I don't want to comment so much about, al-Khawarij, but I'll just make the story short, and I'll say for al-Khawarij, they denied a lot about the scripture, about what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically revealed, and they made their own interpretation. And in fact, the most important thing that they had said was, they're actually very similar to the ISIS of today. They would have a very shallow interpretation for the Quran, a very surfaced interpretation. They know no maqasid al-sharia. They know no details of what fiqh, and no details of what Islam says, and they have a very shallow and a very surfaced interpretation. And then they would basically say, "Ya'ti ya rabbuk," that's it. We're going to have a surface interpretation. We're going to believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes, and that's basically it. And then they don't even connect it with all the different evidences, really because of their ignorance about Islam. Because of their ignorance about Islam, and certainly that's why they even considered if a person were to commit a sin, that's basically going to make them a kafir. So sin does make you a kafir according to al-Khawarij, not Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, absolutely not. Ali ibn Abi Talib was the one that first fought al-Khawarij. Al-Mu'tazila are basically a different group. The most important thing is basically their belief that there is al-manzila bayna al-manzilatayn. Okay, I don't want to go into all of those details, but they basically had certain interpretations to their aqidah, and mainly their interpretation involved using the mind interpretation. So in other words, they don't necessarily regard that in interpreting the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as what the names are saying, but they will reinterpret the names as a metaphorical interpretation. So if you're saying, for example, yadullahi fawqa aydihim, they'll say that, oh, you can't say yad to mean a hand because they'll consider that as tajsim. They'll consider it as making a certain shape for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they'll say, no, you need to say yadullahi fawqa aydihim. You need to interpret that as metaphorically. And this yad is to mean power. So that's one thing about al-Mu'tazila. They basically gave a lot of metaphorical interpretation. Two, a lot of the explanations they considered they would basically use logic as basically beyond the text and what the text is saying. But of course, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they'll say, no, if the text is telling me that, I'm not going to be using my own logic because al-qusur is not within the text, but is within our mind. In other words, we are the one that are narrow in perhaps understanding the text, but we'll just explain the text as it says. It is basically telling us that this is how we apply Sharia, we'll apply it that way. We won't reinterpret the wording to what we think would make a logical statement. So those are some of the things. Okay, now, and of course, Wasl ibn Ata was the main key figure for al-Mu'tazila. Okay, now let's see this one. روى ابن عباس قال سمعت عمر بن الخطاب يخطب فقال أيها الناس إن الرجم حق فلا تخدعن عنه وإن آية ذلك أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قد رجم وأن أبا بكر قد رجم وأنا قد رجمنا بعدهما وسيكون قوم من هذه الأمة يكذبون بالرجم ويكذبون بالدجال ويكذبون بطلوع الشمس من مغربها ويكذبون بعذاب القبر ويكذبون بالشفاعة ويكذبون بقوم يخرجون من النار بعدما انتحشوا. Let's see number one here. So number one, let me interpret this one. I'm gonna go and make it bigger right there. Ibn Abbas narrated that he said, I heard Umar ibn al-Khattab give an oration, and he said, O people, stoning is truth, so do not be betrayed away from it. The evidence to that is that the Prophet ﷺ himself had stoned, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had stoned, and we had stoned after them. And there will be a group of people from this nation that will deny stoning, and they will deny the Dajjal, the Antichrist, and they will deny that the sun is going to come from the west, and they will deny the torments of the grave, and they will deny the intercession on Judgment Day, and they will deny that the group of people will basically come out of hellfire after they had been punished there. And he said, ذكره أبو عمر. Who's Abu Umar? Abu Umar ibn Abd al-Barr. And of course, why did he actually quote from him? He quoted from him because he's basically, Maliki and has that resource. So he said, where did he mention it? So right there, the Muhaqqiq basically said, well, it was mentioned in al-Tamheed. But ironically, that he basically said ذكره Abu Umar, even though this is a second resource, a secondary resource and not a primary resource. And It-Tamheed is basically the book that Abu Umar basically wrote. And It-Tamheed is basically to explain Al-Muwatta itself, which is one of the earliest resources in Hadith that was written by Malik ibn Anas. But here's one thing. What they wanted to do, they did a really good job. And of course, did he actually, hold on, what did he say? Where's the Hasalatain? Oh, okay. This one. Okay. Now the resource, the ones that reviewed basically this book, Tafseer al-Qurtubi, they said al-Tayalisi mentioned it, and basically Musannaf Abd al-Razzaq and Musnad Ahmad, but the most important thing is that it's in al-Bukhari and Muslim, but not in the same wording. So they said بنحوه مختصرا بقصة الرجم. So they said it was basically mentioned in al-Bukhari and Muslim, but in a more brief a quote, basically. What do we learn from this? we learn from this a couple things. Number one is that when we speak about the resource, and this was basically objecting to al-Khawarij as well, all right, because al-Khawarij denied that there was rajm at all, there was stoning at all. Okay, but Umar ibn al-Khattab wanted to note that because it seems like that al-Khawarij were already starting, or in fact, al-Khawarij already basically during the time of the Prophet ﷺ is when they started appearing, at least their ideas and their set. And Umar ibn al-Khattab, you could see, was responding and recognizing that there will be a time when people will basically claim their resources of defining ethics or defining whether it's criminal law or whether punishment or whether it's defining aqidah, that they will deny a number of different key things that were mentioned in the Quran or mentioned in the Sunnah. Rajam was not mentioned in the Quran, by the way. Stoning was not mentioned in the Quran. It was only mentioned in the Sunnah. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ indicated that it was mentioned in the Sunnah by saying, well, the Prophet ﷺ had done it. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq had done it. Why did he say Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? Well, that's because the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that part of the resources that we would take as resources to define ethics, to define right and wrong, is basically certainly number one is Quran, number two is Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ and his practices, the Prophet ﷺ and his statements, that's basically Sunnah. And number three, the practices of the later Sahaba, or the practices after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba themselves are basically a resource. So if you were to say Umar ibn al-Khattab said, and someone comes up and says, well, that's his opinion, نحن رجال هم رجال ونحن رجال, we'll say, wait a minute, you're confusing who you are really. Umar ibn Khattab is not any kind of a man. Abu Bakr is not any kind of a man. The Prophet ﷺ told us to take the Khulafa and to take basically that era as also an era that acts as a foundation as well to help us understand Islam. This isn't any kind of an era to say hum rijalun wa nahnu rijal. Now this is confusing everything. Even Abu Hanifa did not say hum rijal wa nahnu rijal about the Sahaba. He said hum rijal wa nahnu rijal about the later tabi'in. He wasn't talking about the Sahaba. So now recognizing one, resource, two, recognizing that some will actually come to reinterpret the religion to deny Dajjal and that, yeah, this is just nothing but a myth or a legend. That's basically kufr. To deny that one day that the sun is going to rise from the west and consider it as a legend is kufr. And that to deny that adhab al-qabr, the torments in the grave, that this is nothing but a legend is also kufr. Or to deny that there's going to be an intercession on Judgment Day, that's kufr. Or to deny that some people are going to be punished in hellfire and then they would basically leave the hellfire and basically go to Jannah, and to deny that that is going to happen, that's kufr. So therefore, just recognizing that your foundation and your resource to understanding Islam is basically the reference of Quran, Sunnah, and even the athar that were basically narrated upon al-Khulafa or upon al-Sahaba. Those are key resources for us to basically learn our Islam and not make our own interpretation when it's really based on my own imagination. All of this is basically part of tawqifi. This is tawqifi. What does the word tawqifi mean? The word tawqifi means I basically stand in recognition of what was mentioned and I take it as is. توقيفي. Let's see. ذكر الثعلبي في حديث فيه طول عن أبي هريرة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ما معناه. I want you to look at this one because he said that الثعلبي, that Abu Hurairah had mentioned that with, of course, notice he said ما معناه. So in other words, this isn't necessarily the exact wording, but what it would mean that that is the sun would basically تحبس عن الناس, would be kept away. In other words, what do you mean kept away? So the sun for a couple days or perhaps some time, when people will engage in a lot of sin on earth, and even doing what is good is basically becoming forgotten and basically not practiced. And then no one would order for what is good. And then all the different evil behaviors would just become a trend. And that's what everybody knows. Only evil behavior is what people will behave in. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will keep the sun not rising, and it would be under al-arsh. It would be under the throne of the Lord Almighty. What does that look like? This is all ghaib. Who knows? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. That's it. Every time it would prostrate, how does the sun prostrate? Like, what does that even look like? What does it mean that it prostrates? Again, this is ghaib. All right, and then it would ask its Lord Almighty from where it should rise, and then it would not get, that is the sun, it would not get an answer, and even the moon would not get an answer, basically, and then the moon would also prostrate with it, and then it would ask again where it should come out from, but then it would be held and ordered not to rise for 3 nights, well, 3 days and 2 nights, and then they would not know the length of that day except the ones that were doing tahajjud. They would be the ones to recognize that this was a longer night than ever before. And then well, basically here, and they would be only a small group. العصبة or العصابة is a small group. It's not a gang. Okay. And they would be in some Muslim countries, very small group. They would be the only ones to recognize that this was very long, that this was a long night. Why wouldn't the other ones recognize? Because they're just so pacified in their entertainment that they're not even recognizing an end to their entertainment. They're not recognizing anything yet. But then once it stays for 3 nights, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders Jibreel alayhi salam, and then he would say, the Lord Almighty is ordering you to rise from the west. That's when they would rise from the west, but with a shine or with basically the light that is not the light that we would have now. And they would come out as black light, not the sun, and not the shine of the sun, and not the brightness of the sun, and not the brightness of the moon, that we would basically get. It would be very similar to the eclipse way of shining, basically the eclipse darkness.
Really?
And that's what it means. وَجُمِعَ الشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ. That's what is basically the interpretation of the moon and the sun would basically be combined. And that's the interpretation. إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. Then they would come out and basically come out as camels that have horns. Now, what does that look like? Allahu A'lam. This is all to help us understand some of the different things that we may not recognize right now. But then, of course, Jibreel alayhi salam would come and take them and would basically it would shine in the west. Okay, to make the story short, okay, I would right there want you to take it. I want you to basically go to this يوم يأتي بعض آيات ربك لا ينفع نفسا إيمانها لم تكن آمنت من قبل أو كسبت في إيمانها خيرا. This is basically the interpretation for that ayah, is that Shams, the sun and the moon, at that time would basically be covered in some light that, or in some darkness at least, and the brightness of the sun and basically the radiation, or at least the radiation of the sun and the brightness of the moon would basically not be the same. And then throughout these times, that's basically how they will see it as a new normal sunrise, or at least sunrise rising from the west. Okay, let's look at this one. Is this actually authentic? You could say that Tabari narrated something similar. When we say Tabari died 210 Hijriya. Okay? Tabari, or 310, sorry, 310 Hijriya. Tabari basically decided to write his tafsir differently. He doesn't do tafsir like what you would see right now in putting his own statements, or at least his own interpretation, and connecting these things. Tabari uses what is called the tafsir bil-ma'thur. What is it, tafsir bil-ma'thur? Tafsir bil-ma'thur meaning that he would go back to the ahadith and the athar. Al-hadith is different than athar, because al-hadith is what is narrated upon the Prophet ﷺ. Al-athar would be what was narrated upon the Prophet's companions. Okay, so Tabari would just say Mujahid, for example, said this, and here's that narration. Ibn Abbas said this, and here's the narration. Muqatil said this, and here's the narration. That's what he would do. السيوطي in الدر المنثور. الدر المنثور is, it's not that, I mean, the copy was rather big. I mean, it was like not an A4, but it was like an A3 paper. It was really big. And the Dur al-Manthur is Dur al-Manthur is in a couple volumes, really, not too big. At least in the number of volumes, but they do have a big copy, an A3 copy, at least at the time during my university. But look at this one. أخرجه ابن مردوي بسند واهن. What is that supposed to mean? That the chain of narration that Ibn Mardawayh basically had noted to it was basically sanadin wahin. In other words, the chain of narration is not a strong chain of narration. And that's the same thing you could see that Ahmad, Musnad Ahmad, basically this is the hadith number, okay, had narrated upon Abdullah ibn Amr, and not necessarily based on, who was it here? Was it Abu Hurairah? Okay, so is this necessarily the detail that we understand is authentic, in terms of that the sun would basically prostrate and then it would be ordered, etc. You could see that it was Abu Hurairah that basically had mentioned, but notice that Al-Qurtubi said ma ma'nah. So he was basically putting in his wording to explain how the sun would basically rise from the west and what would really happen. Do we necessarily have all that information? We don't necessarily have all the information of what will happen then, what will this look like, what would basically be the response, how long this would be for. There is another hadith, but that hadith is not authentic, that tells us that would last for 120 years. 120 years that the sun would be rising from the other side. Okay, so like I said, that's not necessarily an authentic narration, but just wanted to mention it. So inshallah, we would stop right here, because there's, we've got a couple hadith that speak about Judgment Day and some of the signs of Judgment Day. Inshallah, we're going to continue that, not tomorrow. Tomorrow I have a meeting, but inshallah, the day after tomorrow, we've got the fiqh. Well, when we come back to our tafsir class, because tomorrow I've got, like I said, I've got the meeting, so I won't be able to do class tomorrow, but inshallah. Oh, and Saturday as well. I also have the meeting on Saturday as well. Inshallah, we'll have to do the fiqh class on Sunday, inshallah. That's a makeup class on Sunday, because we need to start the new semester. So we still have to finish that fiqh of marriage and the portion that we were doing in the fiqh of divorce. So we'll come back on Sunday because tomorrow and the day after I have meetings. So on Sunday, well, at least your Saturday, my Sunday, we'll come back inshallah to do the fiqh of worship. And then Monday, well, your Sunday, my Monday, your Sunday is fiqh of worship. Well, not fiqh of worship, but fiqh of marriage.
Yes.
Sorry, fiqh of marriage. And then so that would make it, oh, it's going to be a couple days from now. But hopefully, inshallah, we'll remember everything. And, inshallah, well, we're still continuing. And سبحانك اللهم بحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. And meanwhile, let's at least read this ayah, because we definitely don't want to end it in signs of judgment day. قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين. That's it. قل إنني هداني ربي إلى صراط مستقيم دينا قيما ملة إبراهيم حنيفا وما كان من المشركين قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين. All right. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah.
Just want to know, confirm, inshallah, on Friday, no fiqh?
On yes, because I will be having a meeting
Meeting.
in my kids' school, so I have to be there.
Only Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah.
No fiqh, no tafsir tomorrow also.
Yeah, no tafsir tomorrow also because I have a meeting.
Okay. Allah يبارك فيك.
Allah يبارك فيك يا ربي, and so sorry about that.
No
So
worries.
meanwhile, I will, inshallah, if there are any questions before we end, okay? Because I love your questions.